And I'm going to move us now into our first roundtable discussion. A couple of words first about format. We're going to have 3 presenters. They're each going to do their presentations, and then we're going to move into a roundtable discussion, which will include Q&A and discussion with all of you. We've already heard a little bit both from John Reinhardt and from Dean Wildner-Bassett about some of the underlying motivations for a symposium like this. And so we've called the roundtable discussion New Literacies and New Understandings. And from different perspectives, from different fields, drawing on different research, our 3 roundtable discussants are going to help us to explore a little bit in what ways exactly are these new literacies changing communication, in what ways are they creating new opportunities for meaning making, in what ways are they compelling us to construct knowledge differently, to understand the world differently, to communicate differently. So I'm going to move now to our first presenter, who is Idoia Elola. She is Associate Professor of Spanish and Applied Linguistics and Second Language Studies at Texas Tech University. Her research focuses mainly on issues in second language writing, such as collaborative and individual writing when using Web 2.0 tools, foreign language and Spanish heritage language learners' writing processes, and revision and feedback. And she's published widely on these topics, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of her forthcoming publications, one that's on collaborative writing through the use of Web 2.0 tools, and another that's on online and blended environments and their use in education. Her talk for us today focuses on one of her specialties on L2 writing and Web 2.0 tools, and it's titled L2 Writing in the 21st Century, Acknowledging New Literacies. Please join me in welcoming Idoia Elola.
Can you hear me? Is it okay? Okay. First of all, thank you, mainly to University of Arizona, but more concretely to Dr. Warner and Reinhardt for thinking about me for this symposium. I'm coming from second language writing background, so for me, what I'm doing today in this presentation is kind of a self-reflection at the same time of what I'm going through, this trying to understand these new literacies and how technology are changing the way we're looking at writing as well. I would like to start very briefly addressing that. I will try to talk a little bit about the notion of stability and divergence, and I will touch briefly on the interface of rhetorical and SLA theories, diverse research studies that have been done, concept of new genres, the adoption of task-based approach for some of the practices that I've been working with, the concept of new assessments that I think that is very important and we should be thinking about this as well. And finally, the interface of SLA, applied linguistics, with new technologies. Let me start first with a brief analogy. And I just wanted to share with you something that I was reading from Peter Elbow. It's a chapter about new literacies, and he is telling us a little bit the cyclical nature of language and literacies, and how in the history of the world we have a tendency first to think of an standardization of the language, and that will translate into the writing as a way of thinking of the correctness of the language, and in a way imposing a single standard of writing. This is a very common thing. This has been happening even from the 15th century, and let me give you the example of Spain. In 1492, a very important year for the Hispanic community, we get the first Spanish grammar. And it's not just a Spanish grammar to standardize the language, it's also a symbol of a beginning of a nation. So sometimes the standardization not only has the literacy perspectives behind it, but it's something more. But as it's a cyclical thing, then we have the divergence. And it's when people feel like language is falling apart, that it seems like there's a decline of the language. And it's when we move to different cultures of literacies. And so I feel like this is basically the moment we are in. I think we're in the divergence moment. This is when we are approaching new cultures of literacy. And so I think this is the most exciting time to be around the university at this point. And Peter Elbow also mentions the new Wild West. And I love that analogy because I'm in Texas and I'm just trying to understand Texans, little by little. But it's this idea that it's kind of a difficult line between sometimes spoken language and written language. And so he proposes a naked rhetorical space where there are no impositions, and he uses this idea that there is no sheriff with a badge or the guns. So I think that hopefully, I'm not saying that this is where we will move towards, but it's an idea that we can start thinking about. But I definitely think that we're in the divergence cycle. Literacies in the 21st century is obviously not just the language correctness or whether language divergence. I mean, we know that technology is basically where we're all here today. So, but technology, very briefly, it can be many things during history. It was the quills in the Middle Ages, it was the steel pen in the 18th century, the typewriter starting in the 1920s, computers, smartphones. This is basically where we've been dealing with when we talk about technology. And so nowadays, what I'm working more is with social tools. So we move from blogs, wikis, iMovie, Final Cut, YouTube, you name it. So all of these tools are there for us to use. And so for someone coming from L2 writing that has been thinking about academic writing most of their life, and suddenly having the opportunity to work with social tools and seeing the changes that our students are going through in their writing is exciting. I'm not trying to sell you everything, but I think it is. So basically, one of the things that I wanted to share with you is that this interest is also growing for what I see when I go to a coffee shop, when I'm in class, and I think I put it in my abstract. You know, all of a sudden our physical body is like this. You know, you see everybody going like this. So this is like a phenomenon. I mean, we write much more today than we've ever written before. There's a study says that young people text around 20 times a day, and I was corrected by a teenager that was not true, they test more. But if you put all those things together, it's like one page, both sides of writing. Obviously, it's not an academic writing, but who would have thought, 50 years ago that we will be doing that constantly in a vernacular language. So we have maybe short types of communications, longer types of communications, but those communications are happening. And what I'm more interested in is this ability of people to work collaborative, work together, share ideas, and share a new language when they are writing. Sorry, I just moved the wrong one. Okay. So I come from two different perspectives. One is applied linguistics with more interest in rhetoric, and also from SLA. So one of the things that I've noticed is how we apply these theoretical models to the new literacies, and more particularly to writing. And so obviously, the applied linguistics has always focused more on the development of multi-language written literacy capacities, whereas SLA has always been exploring L2 development. Obviously, in writing, and if you are not aware of that, there is a moment of crisis right now, which is wonderful, because all of a sudden in SLA, we're trying to figure out what are we doing with the writing. It's just not a literacy, it's not just something that is not leading us to acquisition, since we are noticing that when our students are writing, they're using implicit and explicit knowledge. So it's not just the explicit knowledge and the literacy, which SLA has never paid much attention to, but I think that is implicit knowledge, and we should be exploring that. And I think that in new literacies, even more. We need to know what's happening. So there is an overlap in these two disciplines. I mean, they all work with instruction, assessment, feedback, error, and genre. But it was through feedback that we realized that we were talking and we had all these conflicting ideas about what feedback and whether error correction was important or not. From an applied linguistic point of view, we want to see that improvement. From an SLA point of view, they want to see whether that error or that feedback is taking us to acquisition. And so it's taking us some time to figure out what each discipline can bring to second language writing. And we are doing all of this based mostly on academic writing. We're doing we're asking our students to write descriptions, narrations, if it's an upper level, we're asking them to write exposition, argumentation. But what happens with these two disciplines when we are introducing new technologies and we are observing the emergence of new literacies? Something is missing, I think, in this picture. Calico, journals like Calico, or for example, Language Learning and Technology, they're doing a great work, a great job of bringing these things together so we start thinking and reflecting about it. But journals of second language writing, for example, which is like primordial for anyone in L2 writing, are still not addressing those issues at length. This is a little bit so you can see that in many cases we've been treating the same aspects of second language writing, sometimes looking at them from a different perspective. And for example, like writing processes has been always very helpful to tell us how we can approach or how we can help our students to write in a second language, where in SLA we've been thinking more of time allocation and how those processes are working towards or influencing each other. So if you look at a little bit at how I started thinking of writing, I started always thinking of writing processes. That was my main concern. And so I've been using Think Aloud protocols, similar recalls, and I've been using Camtasia as a research tool. I mean, I was not using technology to see what was happening with our writers. And I was following more of a cognitive theoretical approach. And something wonderful happened when I started collaborating with a colleague. Most of you might know her, Dr. Anna Oskov, and she introduced me technology. And so we were talking, and for me technology was still a little bit like an instrument. It's like, oh great, we can use it. Until I started looking at the product of the writing, and then when I realized that was different, something was happening at that point. So we started working with collaborative academic writing. And so one of the things that we managed to incorporate in these classes is a multimodality approach. So we asked our students to use discussion boards to write about the content, their ideas, sometimes about their tasks, what was happening. And so when we were doing that, we realized that there was like two different types of languages. One, more academic, trying to sound like they knew what they were talking about the task or the content. And then another one that was more vernacular language. It was just sharing ideas, talking about it, and figuring out what they were supposed to do. And then we used the wikis as the media in which they will be able to write collaboratively and more or less change drafts and so on through the use of chats. So we had, in one sense, vernacular language, academic language in the discussion board, more academic writing in wikis, and then in the chats, it was all vernacular language. So we see this mixing of languages and working very well towards the final product. For that, we've been using more a social cultural theory. But what I'm going to tell you today, or I'm going to show you a little bit today, is where we've been discovering when we start to move towards digital stories as part of the class. I mean, normally we use the fourth, the last, like a capstone course, so that our students can, read to that academic level. But also we were thinking, what happens if we start using some other type of task in which we might get them more involved, more motivated? And so let's see what can happen. So we decided to use a cooperative writing activity in which they will each develop their own digital story, but they will have to work with each other. So that's why I mentioned cooperative. And so they will call circles in which they will get together and they will talk about it and see what are the changes that they might have. Now, if we are moving from an academic perspective, and they've been doing this for a long, long time, and you move them to a digital story assignment, you have to kind of lead them all the way so they see what is really happening. And so one of the things that I think that it was important, it was to see how the idea of a digital story made them reflect not only on the language, but also on the genre. And this is a narrative genre that they've been using academically before. And for this, we use an activity theory model. And so let me tell you why we thought this was important. And we're still learning from it. What we liked about this activity theory model was this dynamic interrelationship between all the elements. Obviously, the students or the subjects that are in these studies, obviously, they are advanced Spanish language learners. And what we wanted to see is how these tools were mediating towards achieving that goal, or help them reorient themselves towards a goal. And so obviously the object that they are working towards is definitely the digital story. But we're more interested, or at least I'm more interested in, is to be able to push these students toward becoming more effective writers in the 21st century. That is the outcome. That's where we want them to go. And then, of course, we were able to see how they divide the work, how do they talk to each other, how they create this community, of practice, because they became aware of the terms, what they had to use, and so on. And then the rules is not just the rules of the class, how the class has to be conducted, but how they understand the task, because we realized that when we give them instructions to these students, what happened most of the time is that they are not able to understand what we want them to do. So they seem like, yeah, we understand it. And then when they are talking to each other, we realize that their goal is very different from our goal. So to get them to that point, I mean, you have to be working with them at different stages. So an example of a digital story, I have one at the end. I don't think I have the time to show you, but at least if we look back at the elements of the activity theory, I'm going to show you a little bit what happens after we were working with the digital stories. So the first two bullets more or less tells you a little bit about the outcome, what were we expecting. And so one was to encourage the learners to become effective communicators in the 21st century and push them to learn a new set of multimodal community conventions. I mean, this is something that we did little by little, and I'll explain how. But what I thought was very important, at least from my point of view, is the second and third bullet, in the sense that they are working with the written language, but also they have a sense of the oral telling nature of the script. So we are asking them to work in an academic task first as a narrative, and then we're asking them to use that as a script to do or to use in the digital story. So what happens is that your mindset has to change. You cannot just take the narrative and read it aloud, and that's part of the digital story. That will not make a lot of sense. But you have to transfer that information to the students, because otherwise they don't have a sense of what you want them to do. And then also the appropriate stylistic devices to suit that type of narration. And they are discovering this as they are working with it. And one of the things that I want to point out is integration of sound and image. This is not to make it pretty, not to have a digital that is like, ooh, this is a perfect picture, or oh, this song, I love it. No, they have a functional aspect to their integration. One is to move the story along. Another one is to connect the narration and evoke emotions. And the one I think it is especially important for new literacies is how they function as content fillers and connectors. One of the things that we have to work with them was this idea that when they are writing a narrative, they're giving more information. When they move to the digital story, we want those images and sound to be part of the narrative. So an image, it will be like substituting maybe one or two sentences. And the same with the music. I mean, the music sometimes was a perfect conductor for moving from one idea to the other. But if this is not done correctly, that's not a narrative. I mean, this is, again, is someone talking and having music and sound. And so this is something this is new for us, at least from the perspective of second language writing. And another thing that we notice is the motivation of exploring additional vocabulary. For us that teach languages to our students, we're always trying to find context in which vocabulary can work. And basically what happened in these activities is that students were very conscious of an audience. The fact that this was going to be in a social media, that people will be able to see what the digital stories was about, made them understand what actually audience means. Because in most cases when they write to the teacher or the professor. This is like, okay, this is my audience, this is what I'm going to write, and so on. When you give them a real audience, I mean, they have a sense of authorship that we don't see in many other academic writing papers. And so basically what we were able to observe in all of this is that they were looking for vocabulary that will really transfer those emotions, and they were very careful choosing which ones to use. They also were able to interpret and negotiate a new set of rules. Having to deal with the digital story was not easy for them at the beginning, and so that's what we were working towards. And then they were easily uploaded, and so the sense of community expanded. It was a new era for all of them, and that gave them a sense also of empowerment. I mean, when they talk about their reflections, and they were telling us whether it had worked or whether something that we shouldn't use it again. I mean, one of the things that they said is, "I'm finally writing." And we're thinking, you've been writing for a whole semester, you know, but it's like when they felt that they were really writers, that they were saying something, you know. And it's very interesting because to move them to that point is kind of hard because they're so used to academic writing that when we were asking them, just be a little bit more vernacular in a way, they were like fighting it. It's like, this is not going to sound that academic, and so on. And then of course, this conception of writing act. So this is some of the things that they said. Traditionally, we offer messages in written form under the modalities of exposition and argumentation, and those who had the ability to make magic with words could express with written words their motivation and emotions. With the digital stories, that magic is not a limitation. By using creativity, we have the possibility to visualize, give dynamism, and audio to our ideas, transforming them into a work of art. Who has said that in a foreign language class before? The digital story is a different type of writing technique and requires a different thinking process. And that's what I'm so interested about this. I really want to explore all these areas. To get to that point, to make this activity successful, that's what I was mentioning, that we use a task-based approach. And so you can see that they have like different phases, and each phase was very thought out, so they will have enough time not only to learn something new, but also reflect and figure it out. So this is something that it took a whole semester to complete. Not that they were working in the digital story, but in order to get to that point, they needed to understand what type of images they had to use, what was the meaning of the sound, and work towards that area. So this is a little bit what we did. So, I mean, you can see that it takes 16 weeks to do this project. And another thing is the idea of assessment has to change. I mean, we cannot be using, rubrics with a structure and organization and so on. I mean, we can still do that with the script and the oral narration, but basically what we want to see is how the whole activity, using all those modalities, can help them to be able to write something that makes sense to them. So all of a sudden the categories move to purpose of a story, point of view, pronunciation, pacing, audio elements, image elements, economy, credits and citations, effects, motion and transitions, language and vocabulary. These two, we expect to find in a regular rubric, but the rest is what makes it more interesting. So this is just very briefly to say that we are, I think, in a moment of intersection. I think that we know a lot from, applied linguistics or rhetorics. We are learning a lot more about SLA and how we can work with writing. But now this idea of using, Web 2.0 technologies and the emergence of all these new literacies has to make us think more about what we're doing in the classes and how we're going to address many of the issues that are going to come up when we are working more seriously with the new literacies. So that red area that you see here is the red area that is over here. But I think that we still have to explore all of this. Of course, L2 writing development is important. I mean, the use of vernacular language, academic language should be part of what we're working with. Task-based approaches, in our case, have worked very well because we could face the whole process and sequence it correctly. Working collaboratively or cooperatively, it's been a good way for our students to construct language, to think about it, and also to debate with us sometimes whether that makes sense or not. We knew new assessment approaches, obviously. I think that it will be very interesting to see if, cognitive approaches are different, and maybe we can learn from that. And I think that we are basically moving to one genre-based approaches. I think that all these genres are somehow old, but they are like new as well. And of course, technology is going to keep changing and moving forward, and we have to move with the times. So if you don't have this book in Digital Literacies in Foreign and Second Language Education, edited by Wickham and Dr. Williams over here, they have several definitions of the notions of new literacies. This is one that I think I like, and I think it kind of defines or describes what I feel like we're trying to do at this point in time. And I think the new literacies are multiple, obviously multimodal and multifaceted. So let's celebrate divergence. from the traditional definition of literacy and allow for convergence from different fields and disciplines to comprehend new literacies better. Thank you.